The habits that got you through the first half of life are destroying the second half. Not your work habits or your health habits, though those matter too. Your emotional habits, the patterns of how you respond to feelings, how you process stress, how you protect yourself from pain. These patterns formed decades ago when you were younger, when your circumstances were different, when survival required different strategies, and they worked. They helped you cope with difficult parents, navigate unstable relationships, endure soul-crushing jobs, raise children while exhausted. But now? Now those same emotional habits are sabotaging you. They're creating distance in your relationships. They're keeping you stuck in patterns you claim you want to change. They're preventing the growth and transformation you say you're seeking. And the worst part? You don't even see them as habits. You see them as just who you are, as your personality, as unchangeable traits you've carried your entire life. But they're not. They're learned responses, coping mechanisms that calcified into automatic patterns. And what worked at 30 doesn't work at 50. What protected you then imprisons you now. The second half of life demands different emotional habits. And if you don't identify and change the ones sabotaging you, you'll spend the rest of your life wondering why nothing ever feels different. Here's the paradox. The emotional habits sabotaging you now were once your greatest strengths. The ability to suppress your emotions and power through. That's what got you through years of stress and responsibility when falling apart wasn't an option. The tendency to avoid conflict at all costs? That kept the peace in relationships where direct confrontation would have been dangerous or destructive. The habit of intellectualizing everything instead of feeling it? That protected you from being overwhelmed by grief, fear, or anger you didn't have the resources to process. These weren't weaknesses. They were survival strategies, and they worked. They helped you function when functioning felt impossible. They got you to where you are now. But that's the problem. Where you are now isn't where you were then, and the strategies that once protected you are now preventing you from living fully. The emotional habit of suppression, for instance, was essential when you were raising kids, building a career, caring for aging parents, all while trying to hold yourself together. You couldn't afford to feel everything you were feeling. You had to compartmentalize, push feelings aside, deal with them later, except later never came. And now, decades later, you're so disconnected from your emotional life that you don't even know what you're feeling most of the time. You've become numb. And that numbness, which once felt like protection, now feels like emptiness. You go through the motions of life without really feeling alive. But you can't just flip a switch and start feeling again. The suppression habit is so ingrained that emotions feel dangerous, overwhelming, unmanageable. So you keep suppressing, even though there's nothing left to suppress for. You're protecting yourself from a threat that no longer exists. The same is true for conflict avoidance. Maybe you grew up in a household where conflict meant violence or abandonment. Or maybe you were in relationships where expressing your needs led to punishment or rejection. So you learned to keep the peace, to accommodate, to make yourself smaller so others could be comfortable. And that habit kept you safe. But now, in the second half of life, it's destroying your relationships. Because avoiding conflict doesn't prevent problems. It buries them. And buried problems don't disappear. They fester. Your resentment builds. Your needs go unmet. Your relationships become shallow and transactional because you never risk being honest about what you actually feel or want. And the people closest to you, they don't know you. They know the version of you that accommodates, that keeps the peace, that never makes waves. But they don't know who you actually are. Because you've been hiding for so long, you've forgotten too. Then there's the habit of intellectualizing, of living in your head instead of your body, of analyzing your feelings instead of feeling them. This habit develops early, often in childhood, as a way to make sense of chaos or to feel in control when everything around you felt out of control. And it's a brilliant strategy. Thinking is safer than feeling. Understanding is less vulnerable than experiencing. But intellectualizing creates distance. You observe your life instead of living it. You can describe your emotions with clinical precision without actually feeling them. You know what you should feel, what you're supposed to feel, but you don't feel it. And that disconnect is exhausting. It's why therapy or self-help often feels hollow. You're gaining insight without transformation. You understand yourself better, but nothing actually changes. Because change doesn't happen in your head. It happens in your body, in your nervous system, in the felt experience of emotion. And as long as you're intellectualizing, you're avoiding that experience. Here's where the paradox becomes cruel. You want to change. You know these habits aren't serving you anymore. You can see how suppression is making you numb, how conflict avoidance is eroding your relationships, how intellectualizing is keeping you stuck. But you can't stop, because these habits are your identity. They're how you've survived. They're the part of you that's reliable, that doesn't collapse, that keeps everything together. And letting go of them feels like letting go of yourself. Like dismantling the only thing holding you up, so you stay stuck. Aware of the problem, but unable to solve it. Wanting different results while repeating the same patterns. Frustrated with yourself for not changing, while terrified of what would happen if you did. And the cultural narrative doesn't help. Society tells you that emotional habits are personality traits. That if you're not an emotional person, that's just who you are. That if you don't do conflict, that's a valid preference. That if you're logical and rational, that's a strength to be proud of. But these aren't personality traits. They're coping mechanisms. And what you needed to cope with at 25 is not what you need at 55. The second half of life doesn't reward emotional suppression. It doesn't reward conflict avoidance. It doesn't reward living in your head. The second half demands presence, authenticity, emotional honesty, and if your habits prevent those things, you'll spend the rest of your life feeling disconnected, unfulfilled, and wondering why everything you do to improve your life never actually makes you feel better. Changing emotional habits in the second half of life begins with recognizing them as habits, not identity. This is the first and most difficult shift. You've probably spent decades believing that your way of handling emotions is just who you are, that you're not good with feelings, or not confrontational, or analytical by nature. But these aren't fixed traits. They're patterns you learned, and patterns can be unlearned. The moment you stop defending these habits as personality and start seeing them as choices, choices you made long ago for good reasons but can now make differently, is the moment change becomes possible. This doesn't mean judging yourself for having these habits. It means recognizing that they were adaptive once and can be modified now. The most common sabotaging habit in the second half is emotional suppression, and changing it requires learning to feel again. Not all at once, not dramatically, but gradually. The first step is simply noticing when you're suppressing. You're in a conversation and something hurts your feelings, but you smile and act like it's fine. You're frustrated with your partner, but you tell yourself it's not worth bringing up. You're grieving something you lost, but you push it aside and stay busy. These are moments of suppression, and the practice is to notice them without immediately trying to fix or change them. Just notice. I'm doing it again. I'm pushing this feeling away. That noticing creates a tiny gap between the feeling and the suppression, and in that gap, you have a choice. Once you can notice the suppression, the next step is to pause before suppressing. This doesn't mean you have to express every feeling immediately. It means you create a moment of space where you actually let yourself feel it before deciding what to do with it. You feel the hurt. You let it land in your body. You notice where it shows up. Tightness in your chest, tension in your jaw, heaviness in your stomach. And you stay with it for just a few seconds, not forever, just long enough to acknowledge that it's there. This practice sounds simple, but it's revolutionary for someone who's spent decades suppressing, because it trains your nervous system that feelings are survivable, that you can feel something without being destroyed by it, and that changes everything. Another critical emotional habit to address is conflict avoidance. And the shift here isn't to suddenly become confrontational or aggressive. It's to learn that conflict and connection aren't opposites. Most people who avoid conflict believe that expressing disagreement or voicing their needs will damage relationships. But the opposite is true. Avoiding conflict damages relationships. It creates distance, resentment, and inauthenticity. Real connection requires the ability to tolerate tension, to say, "This bothered me," or "I need something different," without catastrophizing the outcome. And that starts with small experiments, not with the biggest, scariest conflict, but with minor disagreements, expressing a preference you'd normally suppress, gently pushing back on something instead of automatically agreeing. These small moments of honesty are practice, and they teach you that conflict doesn't equal disaster. One of the most effective ways to shift away from conflict avoidance is to reframe what conflict means. For most people, conflict feels like a threat to the relationship. Like if you express dissatisfaction, the other person will leave, attack, or withdraw love. But conflict, when handled skillfully, is actually repair. It's how you clear the air, how you realign, how you make sure both people's needs are visible in the relationship. When you start seeing conflict as a tool for connection rather than a threat to it, your nervous system starts to relax. You stop bracing for disaster every time there's tension, and you can engage more honestly because you're not operating from a place of fear. The habit of intellectualizing is perhaps the hardest to shift because it feels like giving up your primary tool for understanding the world. People who intellectualize are often highly intelligent, and their ability to analyze has served them well professionally and socially. But in the emotional realm, analysis is avoidance, and the shift required is moving from understanding to experiencing. This means practicing being in your body instead of your head, and that starts with physical awareness. When you notice yourself spiraling into analysis, trying to figure out why you feel a certain way, what it means, what you should do about it, pause. Drop your attention into your body. Where do you feel this emotion physically? What does it feel like? Tight, heavy, hot, fluttery, you're not trying to interpret it. You're just noticing it. This is radically different from how you've been operating, and it feels uncomfortable at first. But it's the only way to move from intellectual understanding to embodied change. Another powerful practice for shifting intellectualizing is to use simple language for emotions instead of complex explanations. When someone asks how you're feeling, instead of saying, well, I think what's happening is that I'm processing some unresolved attachment issues from my childhood, and it's manifesting as anxiety in this situation. You say, I'm anxious. That's it. No analysis, no backstory, just the feeling. This simplicity feels reductive to someone who's used to intellectualizing, but it's actually more honest, because the analysis is often a way to avoid the rawness of the feeling itself, and when you strip that away, you're left with the direct experience, which is uncomfortable, but also real. For all three of these habits, suppression, conflict avoidance, and intellectualizing, the underlying work is the same: learning to tolerate discomfort. These habits exist because they help you avoid discomfort. Suppression avoids the discomfort of feeling. Conflict avoidance avoids the discomfort of tension. Intellectualizing avoids the discomfort of being emotionally vulnerable. And if you want to change these habits, you have to be willing to feel uncomfortable. Not constantly, not forever, but regularly. Because discomfort is where growth lives. And in the second half of life, if you're not growing, you're stagnating. One of the most effective ways to practice tolerating discomfort is through small, deliberate exposures. If you suppress emotions, practice sitting with a feeling for 30 seconds longer than you usually would. If you avoid conflict, practice expressing one mild disagreement per week. If you intellectualize, practice naming one feeling per day without explaining it. These practices feel small, almost trivial, but they're not. They're reconditioning your nervous system. They're teaching your body that discomfort is temporary, that you can survive it, that it won't destroy you, and that learning is what allows the habit to shift. Because the habit exists to protect you from something your nervous system believes is dangerous. And when your nervous system learns that it's not actually dangerous, the habit loses its grip. Another essential component of changing emotional habits is noticing the payoff. Every habit has a payoff, some benefit it provides, and until you understand what you're getting from the habit, you can't effectively change it. Suppression, for example, gives you the payoff of appearing strong and in control. Conflict avoidance gives you the payoff of feeling safe and maintaining the illusion of harmony. Intellectualizing gives you the payoff of feeling smart and avoiding vulnerability. These payoffs are real, and your nervous system doesn't want to give them up, so you have to find alternative ways to meet those needs. If you need to feel in control, you have to find healthier ways to create that feeling than suppressing your emotions. If you need to feel safe, you have to build that safety internally rather than by avoiding all tension. If you need to feel competent, you have to develop emotional competence rather than hiding in your intellect. This isn't easy work, but it's necessary work. Changing emotional habits also requires self-compassion. These habits developed for good reasons. They protected you when you needed protection. And beating yourself up for having them doesn't help. It just reinforces the shame that often underlies these patterns. Instead, you have to approach yourself with curiosity and kindness. Of course, I suppress my emotions. I had to in order to survive my childhood. Of course, I avoid conflict. Every time I expressed my needs growing up, I was punished. Of course, I intellectualize. Feelings were never safe in my family. When you understand the origins of these habits, you can hold them more gently. And from that gentleness, change becomes possible. Not because you're forcing yourself to be different, but because you're creating space for something new to emerge. It's also important to recognize that these habits are maintained by the people around you. If you've been suppressing your emotions for 30 years, the people in your life are used to that. They expect you to be the strong one, the one who doesn't complain, the one who holds it together. And when you start expressing feelings, they might not respond well. They might tell you you're being too sensitive, that you're overreacting, that this isn't like you, and that feedback will tempt you to go back to the old habit. But you can't let other people's discomfort with your growth stop you from growing. Their discomfort is their problem to work through. Your job is to keep practicing the new habit, even when it's socially inconvenient. Similarly, if you've been avoiding conflict, the people in your life might be used to you always agreeing, always accommodating. And when you start setting boundaries or expressing disagreement, they might push back. They might accuse you of being difficult or selfish. But that pushback doesn't mean you're doing something wrong. It means you're disrupting a dynamic that was comfortable for them, but unhealthy for you. And relationships that can't tolerate you being honest about your needs aren't relationships worth preserving in their current form. They either need to evolve or they need to end. And that's a hard truth, but it's a necessary one. Changing these habits also requires patience. You've been practicing suppression, conflict avoidance, or intellectualizing for decades. You're not going to undo that in a week or a month. You're going to slip back into the old pattern constantly. And that's okay. That's part of the process. The goal isn't perfection. The goal is gradual improvement. Notice the habit more often. Catch yourself sooner. Recover more quickly. And over time, months, years, the new pattern becomes more automatic than the old one. But that only happens if you keep practicing. If you stay committed, even when progress feels slow or invisible. One practical tool for changing emotional habits is to identify your triggers. What situations consistently activate the old pattern? For suppression, it might be moments when you feel criticized or when someone needs you to be strong. For conflict avoidance, it might be when your partner is upset or when you're afraid of disappointing someone. For intellectualizing, it might be when you feel vulnerable or when someone asks about your feelings. Once you know your triggers, you can prepare for them. You can anticipate that you'll want to fall back into the old habit and plan an alternative response. Not a perfect response, just a slightly different one. And over time, those slightly different responses accumulate into real change. When you start changing the emotional habits that have been sabotaging you, the first thing you notice is that you feel more alive. Not happier necessarily, not more comfortable, but more alive. Because you're actually feeling things instead of numbing or avoiding them. And feelings, even difficult ones, are what make you human. They're what connect you to yourself and to others. When you stop suppressing, you rediscover emotional range you forgot you had. Joy feels fuller. Sadness feels cleaner. Anger feels purposeful instead of destructive. You're not just going through the motions anymore. You're present in your own life. Your relationships transform. When you stop avoiding conflict, you can finally be honest. You can say what you need, what bothers you, what you want differently. And yes, some people don't handle that well. But the people who matter, the ones who actually care about you, lean in. They appreciate your honesty. They feel safer being honest themselves. Your relationships become real instead of performative, deep instead of shallow. And the resentment you've been carrying for years starts to dissolve because you're no longer betraying yourself to keep the peace. You also develop self-trust. Every time you feel an emotion and don't suppress it, every time you express a need instead of avoiding conflict, every time you stay in your body instead of retreating to your head, you prove to yourself that you can handle discomfort, that you're not as fragile as you feared, that feelings won't destroy you, and that trust changes everything. You stop second-guessing yourself constantly. You stop needing external validation. You start trusting your own emotional responses as valid information instead of problems to be managed. Over time, you realize that the habits that once protected you were also limiting you. They kept you safe, but they kept you small. And now that you're changing them, you have access to parts of yourself you'd forgotten existed. The part that feels deeply, that speaks honestly, that takes up space. And that expansion, that return to wholeness, is what the second half of life is supposed to be about. You don't have to keep living with emotional habits that no longer serve you. The suppression that got you through your 20s and 30s doesn't have to define your 50s and 60s. The conflict avoidance that kept you safe in dysfunctional relationships doesn't have to control your healthy ones. The intellectualizing that helped you make sense of chaos doesn't have to keep you disconnected from your own emotional life. These habits were adaptive once. They helped you survive. But survival and living are different things. And the second half of life isn't about surviving anymore. It's about living fully, feeling deeply, connecting authentically. And you can't do any of that while clinging to emotional habits that were designed to keep you numb, safe, and disconnected. Changing these habits is uncomfortable. It requires you to feel things you've been avoiding for decades, to have conversations you've been postponing, to be vulnerable in ways that feel terrifying. But the alternative is worse. The alternative is spending the rest of your life trapped in patterns that make you feel increasingly isolated, resentful, and empty. Wondering why nothing you do makes you feel better, why your relationships feel hollow, why you can't seem to experience joy the way you used to. The habits are the reason, and they won't change unless you change them. So start small. Notice one moment today where you suppress a feeling, avoid conflict, or retreat into analysis. Just notice it. That's all. And tomorrow, notice it again. And when you're ready, pause before you do it. Create a tiny moment of space where you choose differently. Not perfectly, just differently. And keep choosing. Keep practicing. Keep tolerating the discomfort of growth. Because on the other side of these habits is the life you've been wanting. The one where you feel alive, where you connect authentically, where you finally stop sabotaging yourself and start living fully. That life is possible. But only if you let go of the habits keeping you from it.